Okay, and share screen.
Yep, got it.
Got it. Okay, great. Okay, we're ready to go. So we've learned a little bit about the responsibility and that comes with repayment of and the fines associated with making right when someone has stolen something. And different situations, that fee would be different. What we're going to talk about now is circumstances, situations where that would be waived, and we'll see the extreme kind of circumstances. So we begin. Chapter 3 of the laws of theft, halacha 1. We've already explained in Hilchot Na'arot Betula that whenever a person violates a transgression that is punishable by both capital punishment and a financial penalty, he is not obligated to pay the financial penalty, even though he performed the act unintentionally. In other words, even if you did it unintentionally, you won't actually get the capital punishment, but because it is a transgression that is punishable by capital punishment, it's of that nature. You wouldn't pay the financial penalty. Okay, and we'll talk about specific examples of this in the upcoming halachot. So we're still dealing with the principal idea. We'll dig into some examples soon. When a person performs a transgression that is punishable by lashing and a financial penalty, he shall be lashed and is not required to pay the financial penalty. That means if you transgress a negative command in the Torah, other than those which are punishable by capital punishment. For a person should not receive both punishments, lashing and financial penalty, for the same deed. Therefore, if he performed the act unintentionally, or he was not given a warning, he is required to pay and is not lashed. So different to the capital punishment, where you won't pay even if you don't get the punishment, those offenses for which you would get lashed, you only don't pay if you actually get lashed. Okay? And that the exceptions to that would be if you did it unintentionally or if you were not warned. In those instances, if you weren't warned, if you did it unintentionally, you wouldn't get lashed, and therefore you would still have to pay, even though it's an offense that would be liable for lashes with the ideal circumstances. So when does this apply? When you do the one and not the other. So he says it's when the financial obligation and transgression obligating capital punishment, or the financial obligation and transgression punishable by lashing, come about at the same time. If however he became liable for financial penalty and then became liable for capital punishment or lashing, or became liable for capital punishment or lashing and then became liable for financial penalty, then you'll get both punishments. You'll be lashed and you'll have to pay. You'll pay and then you'll get executed as per the prescribed judgment. So what are some examples of this? Ketzad, what's implied? If someone shoots an arrow on Shabbos, now you're standing in a public domain and you're at the one edge of 4 amot and you shoot it 4 amot. That is a transgression of carrying in the public domain. Now you shoot the arrow and it tears through a garment belonging to somebody else as you're doing that. Or you set fire to a grain heap that belongs to somebody else on Shabbos. Or you stole a wallet on Shabbos and you were dragging it along the ground until you take it from the private domain into the public domain and cause it to be destroyed there. As you only carried it as you were bringing it to the point of destruction. So in all those cases, he's not liable for the damages. Why? Because the prohibition against labor on Shabbos and the prohibition against theft or damage takes effect at the same time, and therefore he's not liable. In other words, because for the Shabbos transgression, whether it was carrying or lighting a fire, you are liable for a capital punishment. You're therefore not liable for the financial payment. If, however, he stole a wallet on Shabbos and lifted it up in the private domain, that means you actually took possession of it while you were in the public domain. So the act of stealing has transpired. And then you walk from that private domain into the public domain, and then you throw it away. So there you do have to make the double payment that you are liable for, because it was two separate things. For he became liable for the theft before he violated prohibition punishable by execution by stoning, which was the carrying in the public domain. The same law applies to any similar situation where you can distinguish between the Shabbos transgression and the financial transgression. Similarly, if a person cut down a tree belonging to a colleague on Yom Tov, and a warning was issued, or he set fire to a grain belonging to a colleague on Yom Kippur, and a warning was issued, or he stole and slaughtered an animal on Yom Kippur, he is not under any financial obligation. These are all offenses for lashes. If, however, a warning was not issued to him, he is liable to pay, because if there's no warning, there's no lashes, and with regard to the slaughter of a stolen animal, he must pay 4 or 5 times its worth. In other words, the financial penalty sticks, whatever it is. If it's an item that you only required to pay double for, you pay double. If it's an animal where you then went and slaughtered or stole it, if it was a sheep or a cow, you pay either 4 or 5 times the full penalty. Halacha 3, if a thief stole a sheep or a cow and slaughtered it on Shabbos or as a sacrifice to a false deity, it was during the week, but it was a sacrifice to a false deity, so that's also a capital offense, he is not liable to pay 4 or 5 times its worth, as explained. This applies even when he performs the transgression unintentionally, again, because it's a capital offense, and it's happening at the same time that he's causing the financial extra penalty that he would otherwise be liable for. If the cow had been lent to him and he slaughtered it on the Shabbos with the intent to steal it, he's not liable even for the double payment for the violation of the prohibition against the laws of Shabbos. The prohibition against theft came about simultaneously because the shechita, which is the problem that he's doing on Shabbos, was the act of stealing in his mind. So long as he was using it as a live animal, he was borrowing it. Now he thinks, I'm going to shecht it and it's going to be mine. Then the two are coming together and you're not liable for the financial because there's the greater liability. For if there's no obligation for theft, there's no obligation for slaughter or for sale. Halacha 5, when a person steals a sheep or a cow and sells it on Shabbos or sells it to a pagan deity, he's obligated to pay 4 or 5 times its amount, for the sale itself does not cause one to incur the death penalty. Okay, the sale is just a rabbinic prohibition, and therefore you're still liable, for the financial penalty. If a forbidden labor was performed on the Shabbos at this time of the sale, the thief is not liable to pay 4 or 5 times its amount. What's implied? Because then it's not the sale that's the concern, it's the act of acquisition, which we'll see in a moment, which is a transgression of Shabbos that becomes primary. So what's the example? He agreed that the sale would not take effect until the animal comes to rest in the courtyard of the purchaser. Right? And in order for it to rest in the courtyard of the purchaser, you're going to actually have to take it from one domain to another. That's when he took the animal from one domain to another domain, the prohibition against labor on the Shabbos, and the sale take effect at the same time, and therefore he's only liable for the Shabbos transgression, which is the greater liability. Halacha 6, when a thief appointed an agent to slaughter a stolen animal for him, and the agent slaughtered it for him on the Shabbos. So now what seems to be happening is a Shabbos transgression and the additional penalty fee of 4 or 5 times. So if it's happening at the same time, he might have thought that he only has to pay the financial, he doesn't have to pay the financial. So he says, no, the thief must still pay 4 or 5 times the animal's worth. Why? Because the thief did not perform a transgression punishable by death. As the shliach who shechted, he has to answer for the Shabbos transgression. But the thief has to answer for the result of shechting the animal, which would make him liable for the financial penalty. And we explain the person who has an agent slaughter for him is liable for the additional payment. Right? It's still his responsibility for that additional damage, and he'll have to pay 4 or 5 times. Halacha 7, when 2 witnesses testify that a person stole a cow or a sheep, okay, which you need, right, in order to bring him to court to make him pay, and then they themselves or 2 other witnesses testify that he slaughtered or sold the animal, the thief is liable to pay 4 or 5 times the animal's worth. It's a clean case. Either the same witnesses or additional witnesses, but for both acts, the stealing and then the selling or shechting were witnessed, and you've got testimony against this guy. But if 2 witnesses testify that the person stole a cow or a sheep, and then only 1 witness testifies that he slaughtered or sold the animal, or the thief himself admitted that he slaughtered or sold the animal on his own initiative, then he only has to pay koifel, the double payment. Right? So you only become liable if the court finds you guilty, which would be by virtue of 2 witnesses testifying. He is not ever liable to pay the 4 or 5 times the animal's worth. And the rationale is that a person who admits his liability for a fine, this is a general rule, is not liable for that penalty, as we've explained. Halacha 8, the following rule applies when a person admits liability for a fine, and then afterwards witnesses come and testify to his liability. So in other words, which one takes precedent? Because we just said that if you admit, you don't have to pay. But if witnesses testify, you do have to pay. So in this situation, you admitted and then witnesses came. So here's what we got to work out. If he made his admission before a court while they were in session, so in other words, his admission was accepted in court, then even if these witnesses come afterwards, he's not going to be liable for the extra payment. But if he made the admission when the court was not in session, so he said it, but not in the presence of a receptive audience, as it were, or he only said it before two judges, not a full bench, and afterwards witnesses came to testify to his liability, he is liable to pay the fine because of their testimony, because his admission is not complete, and therefore when the witnesses come, what they say is primary will determine the liability. Halacha 9. What is implied? So example, right? A thief admitted that he stole to a court while it was in session, and afterwards witness came and testified that he stole. He's not liable for a double payment because he obligated himself for the principal before the witnesses came. He'll pay that, and that's it. If he denied stealing in the presence of a court in this way, freeing himself from liability, and then witnesses came to testify that he stole a sheep or a cow, at which point he admitted. So now he admits again. He says, you know what I did? I stole it. And then a second set of witnesses, or the same set of witnesses, then testify further that he slaughtered or sold the animal that he now admits that he had stolen. He is liable to pay 4 or 5 times the animal's worth, even if he denies that part of it. Okay? The rationale is that first he denied the obligation entirely before the witnesses came, and therefore any additional witnesses will add the liability according to what had transpired. So if he sold it and shechted it in addition to stealing it, even though he didn't admit to it, once the witnesses come, even if he had admitted to it, once the witnesses come, they make him liable because initially he had rejected that. Halacha 10. The following rules apply when a thief steals an ox belonging to 2 partners and slaughters or sells it. Now what happens is he makes an admission to one in the presence of court. So, right? Levi stole a cow that belonged to Reuven and Shimon. He goes to court and he says, you know what, I stole Reuven's cow and I sold it. But then he says to Shimon, I don't know what you're talking about. I never stole or sold a cow. And it happened to be the same cow that belonged to both of them, right? So he's admitted to Reuven, but not to Shimon. So if witnesses come afterwards and testify that he stole or sold, he must pay the partner whose claim he denied 5 times half the value of the ox. If the same situation takes place with regard to the theft of the sheep, he must pay 4 times half the value of the sheep. In other words, he remains liable to the one that he denied. Halacha 11. The law requires the thief to pay the principal and to make the payment of double or 4 or 5 times the value of the theft from his movable property. You got to pay cash or other items. If he does not own movable property, now he doesn't have movable assets that you can take the value from, the court assesses his possessions and expropriates the entire debt from the finest of his landed properties. So I'll expropriate land from him to pay it up. As is the practice with regard to other damages, regarding which the Pasuk says, Meitav Sodeh, he shall pay from the best of his field. Ultimately, we'll come and we'll sell his house, or we'll expropriate a bit of his field in order to pay back that debt that he owes for the penalty, the principal and the penalty. If he owns neither landed property nor movable property, the court sells him as a servant and gives the money from his sale to the person from whom he stole. This is what the verse says, if he has no resources, he shall be sold for his theft. Halacha 12. A man but not a woman may be sold because of theft. This is a law that we have in the oral tradition. A thief is sold only because of the principal. This is important, right? You only sell him for the value of the principal, but not for the payment of twice or 4 or 5 times the amount of the theft. If he can repay the principal, the additional amount remains a debt incumbent on him until he acquires the resources. So he stole something worth turnaround. He has to pay that, and it's gone now. So he has to pay 200 plus 200, but he only has 200 available. He pays the 200. The rest remains a liability that he'll pay at some point when he can make it. But we don't expropriate anything from him to make that penalty payment once the principal has been repaid. When a person steals from a Gentile or steals consecrated property, he is not sold for the principal, even though because he doesn't owe it to an individual. Instead, it remains a debt incumbent upon him until he acquires the resources. We would only sell him if he owes to an individual. Halacha 14. When the principal of a theft was worth 100 zuz. Oh, so now we got a problem, right? What is if what he stole was 100 zuz and the thief could only pay 50 zuz? So he hasn't paid the entire principal. We're not talking about now the additional fees of the penalty. So we say he should be sold, and the remainder of the principal and the double payment is considered a debt incumbent on him until he attains his freedom in the 7th year and acquires the resources to pay. If the thief is worth 101 zuz, he should not be sold. This is derived from the above verse, which says he shall be sold for his theft, which implies that his entire worth must be included in the money received for this theft. But if you're going to get more money, that's then you no longer sell it. Okay, so it's quite a complex, interesting scenario. We've got to stick to the precise meaning of the word. So if it rounds off, good. If not, it's we don't sell him. The following rule applies if a person stole and was sold for stole. Okay, so he stole, he couldn't repay it, there was no property, so now the court sells him so that he can repay it. Then, I guess he's freed and he steals again. So if he stole from another person, he should be sold as a servant a second time. Even if he stole from 100 people, he should be sold 100 times. Obviously, that's an exaggeration, but the point is, for each individual, he's liable to the point that if he has no resources, we'd actually sell him in order to repay the person he owes. If however he stole from the first person a second time, if it's the same person, he should not be sold the second time. Instead, the entire amount remains a debt incumbent on him. Halacha 16, if a thief stole from 3 different people, so that's before he's been kind of brought to court to make his payments, they are all considered to be partners for his servitude. So he stole from 3 people and he has no resources to pay any of them. So they all now have a claim on his worth. If the value of his work is equivalent to or less than the principal he owes the 3, he is sold and they divide the proceeds of the sale. The double payments remain a debt incumbent on him until he acquires the resources. If his value exceeds the principal, he should not be sold. Instead, the entire amount remains a debt incumbent on him until he attains the resource. And that goes back again to the verse that he must be sold b'gnei vaso to the worth of what he's sold. But if he's worth more than that, we don't sell. It's only up until that point, that amount. Final halacha, when partners commit a theft together. This reminds me, before I conclude the chapter, it reminds me of the story. 2 partners go to lunch. And the one turns to the other and he says, "Oh, yeah, I better run back to the office. I forgot to lock the safe." To which his partner says, "What are you worried about? We're both here." When partners commit a theft together, the liability is divided among them. Each of them can be sold for his portion of the principal. Okay, because it's now divided. So if the value of one of them is more than his share of the principal, which he is liable, he's not sold. Again, that's rooted in the verse, and you wouldn't sell him there. Okay, Yeshukach. Let's make it a bit smaller so we can see the question and the answers together. If a person unintentionally performs a transgression that is punishable by lashing and a financial penalty, so it's the same act, what punishment is given to him? Remember, okay. So you got to think for a second. Person unintentionally performs a transgression that is punishable by lashing and financial penalty. What punishment is given to him? Only lashes, only financial penalty, or neither lashes, or no?
Financial.
Only financial. Good, exactly.
Yeah.
Because even though technically it's a transgression that would be liable for lashes, because practically he's not getting it, we said in that situation, he's still liable for financial, and that's what he would pay. If a thief stole a sheep and slaughtered it on Shabbos, what is the law? Either he's required to pay 4 or 5 times its worth, he's not required to pay 4 or 5 times its worth. It depends if he slaughtered it knowing that it was Shabbos or not.
This is more serious, so he's not required.
He's not required, right? Because even the last example, which is if he did it unintentionally, basically, because it's the type of offense that you're liable for the death penalty, we said in those situations, the financial penalty falls away. Does the law, in the case of the previous question, change when the thief instructed an agent to slaughter the animal for him? So what are the 3 options? Yes. In this case, the agent is required to pay 4 times the amount of the animal that he slaughtered. Yes. In this case, the thief is required to pay 4 times the amount. Yes. In this case, the thief is not required to pay 4 times the amount of the animal that he slaughtered.
Number two.
Yeah.
Good.
So
Number
it's,
two.
he
Good.
pays
Yeah,
because
this is
the
good.
Shabbos concern is now the agent's concern, but the theft concern is still his concern, and therefore the
Okay.
financial liability for the additional penalty.
If you
Final
didn't
question.
instruct, then the agent would pay.
If he didn't instruct, yeah. How do you do that then? I'm not sure. It's a good question. What happens? Because a ganav min a ganav potter. Anyway, I don't know. I'll have to get. I assume we'll touch on a halacha about that. That's a good question. In other words, I stole something, and then you essentially stole it from me, and were the one that sold it or shechted it. Who's now liable, right? And what are they liable for? We'll get to that, I guess.
Yes.
Final question. If two witnesses testify that a person stole a cow, and one witness has testified that he sold it, what's the law? So three options. The thief is required to pay 5 times worth. The cow, the thief only pays double. He's not required to pay 5 times its worth. Or the thief must swear that he did not sell it, and he only pays double.
Number two.
Yeah, once again, number two. So because ultimately for liability, you need to be able to bring it to court with the testimony of two witnesses. Okay.
Thanks, Ramon.
Thank you.
Yasher koach, Imran. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis.
Good talk.
Thanks,
Good
Rabbi.
talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.